Today we're going to talk about restrictive and non-restrictive adjective clauses. Sometimes these are referred to as essential and non-essential adjective clauses or identifying and non-identifying adjective clauses, but I'll be referring to them as restrictive and non-restrictive adjective clauses. Now, what does that mean? As you know, an adjective clause is a complete clause with a subject and verb that does the job of an adjective. So an adjective clause is describing a noun, just like an adjective describes a noun. So restrictive and non-restrictive adjective clauses are two different types, and they give a different effect for how we're describing that noun. A restrictive adjective clause tells us about that noun. It tells us which one. Maybe that noun is not something specific or definite, and the adjective clause tells us which one when it is restrictive. Now, a non-restrictive adjective clause is for a noun where it's already pretty specific. Maybe it's a name or something that there's only one of. A non-restrictive adjective clause gives us extra information about that noun. It's describing the noun, but the information is extra. It's not necessary for us to understand which one. So let's look at some examples of restrictive and non-restrictive adjective clauses. Our first example sentence is, "My parents who live overseas visit often." Now, when I think about my parents, that's pretty specific. I only have two parents and they are my parents. We know who they are. So, this information that they live overseas is extra information. This makes this a non-restrictive adjective clause because it's not necessary for us to know which parents. We already know they're my parents. So, with a non-restrictive adjective clause like this, we need to add commas before and after the clause. So the sentence will read with comma pauses. My parents, who live overseas, visit often. This is a non-restrictive adjective clause. Okay, let's look at our second example, which is a little bit more complicated. His sister, who lives in Tulsa, is a lawyer. Now let's imagine that he has only one sister. He only has one sister, and we're describing her. We would say his sister, who lives in Tulsa, is a lawyer, just like our example with my parents. His sister, comma, who lives in Tulsa, comma, is a lawyer. But maybe he has more than one sister. Maybe he has two or three sisters. In that case, this could act as a restrictive adjective clause to tell us which one. His sister who lives in Tulsa is a lawyer, and maybe his sister who lives in Seattle is a doctor. You can see how this is a restrictive clause that's telling us which one, which sister. So we use no commas. So restrictive and non-restrictive clauses are important to identify so that you can use your commas correctly. And that's going to change the understanding of the sentence for your reader. Just like we could have two different meanings for this sentence depending on the punctuation, depending on if you treated this as restrictive or non-restrictive. Now there's another reason why this is useful and important. We have our commas, but we also have our relative pronouns, specifically choosing that or which. And we do this differently depending on our restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. Let's look at some examples of this. The book that he read was better than the movie. In this case, we're using that he read as a restrictive adjective clause describing which book. When we just read the book, we don't know which book. It's the book that he read. This is a restrictive adjective clause. So just like this example, we'll use no commas here. But you'll also notice that we used the relative pronoun that. We can use that in restrictive adjective clauses, but we cannot use it in non-restrictive adjective clauses. To explain that a little bit more, we'll look at our final example. The color purple, which was written by Alice Walker, is his favorite book. In this case, the color purple is the name of the book. We already know which book, and this adjective clause, which was written by Alice Walker, is extra information. So this is a non-restrictive adjective clause. So we'll add our commas. So you can see we used the relative pronoun which here. Because this is a non-restrictive adjective clause, we cannot change this to that. We cannot say the color purple that was written by Alice Walker is his favorite book. We cannot use that for non-restrictive adjective clauses. It is possible to use which in a restrictive adjective clause, but it doesn't sound quite right and it's not very common. It's not very common to say, the book which you read was better than the movie. It's much more common to use that in your restrictive adjective clauses and which in your non-restrictive adjective clauses.